The room was full of power. Flags stood tall behind each leader. Cameras flashed. Security guards in black suits lined the walls. It was a global meeting. Africa, Europe, America, all present. The world was watching. But one man sat quietly at the long wooden table. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, only 36 years old, leader of Burkina Faso. He wore his military uniform, simple and firm. No smile, no fear. Across from him sat U.S. diplomats. One leaned forward. His voice was sharp. His words were cold. "Stand back," he told Traoré. "This isn't your place." You could hear a pin drop. Traoré didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes stayed fixed, but something in his jaw tightened. One of the aides whispered, "They're pushing him too far." But Traoré still didn't move. Then he slowly stood up. Everyone held their breath. A U.S. official started to speak again, but Traoré raised his hand. He looked directly into the diplomat's eyes. His voice was steady, quiet. And then he said 3 words that would travel across the world by nightfall. Traoré stood tall. His voice was calm. He looked straight at the U.S. diplomat and said, "This is ours." The room froze. An African delegate gasped. A French advisor looked down in shock. Cameras zoomed in. The U.S. diplomat's face tightened. "Excuse me?" he said. Traoré didn't repeat himself. He just kept his eyes on the man, firm and unshaken. "This is ours." He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He simply claimed what was his, what belonged to his people. It wasn't about ego. It was about truth. "I came here," Traoré said, "not to kneel, but to speak for the children eating dust in Dori, for the mothers burying their sons without a coffin, for the soldiers dying without boots." Silence. Burkina Faso is not a pawn. Africa is not a shadow. A woman from Nigeria wiped her eyes. An old man from Mali bowed his head. The U.S. diplomat leaned back in his chair, unsure what to say. Traoré stepped closer. "You told me to stand back, but my people are behind me, and I will never step away from them." Tears welled in the eyes of many. The cameras kept rolling. The world was listening. The silence in the room grew deeper, but it was not empty. It was filled with memories. One African delegate in his 70s stared at Traoré and whispered, "He sounds like Lumumba." An older woman beside him nodded. "Or Sankara." Traoré kept speaking, softly now, like he was not only talking to the leaders, but to the ancestors watching from above. "My father died building a school with his bare hands," he said. "He believed the knowledge was the only way out. My mother walked 10 kilometers to vote." People were no longer just listening. They were remembering. The Ugandan ambassador had tears running down his cheek. An old South African whispered, "We've waited for someone like this again." A French official looked down, ashamed. Traoré walked slowly back to his seat but didn't sit. "I was told I was too young, too poor, too African," he said. He looked at the cameras. "But I carry a continent, and I will not be silent." Old hands clapped. Slowly at first, then louder. The room didn't just hear him, they felt him. And outside that room, millions were watching and crying. As the applause slowly faded, Traoré looked down at the table. On it sat a small photo, folded, creased, old. He had pulled it from his pocket moments before standing. It was his father, a farmer, dust on his face, a shovel in hand. He held it up. "This man," Traoré said, "planted crops with bleeding hands. He gave me my first book, even when we had no food." A hush fell again. "This is who I speak for," he whispered. "Not politicians, not generals, but forgotten men, like him." The old Senegalese minister lowered his head. "That was my father too," he whispered. Traoré didn't cry, but his eyes glistened. He turned the photo toward the U.S. diplomat. "Tell him to stand back," he said. The U.S. diplomat sat in silence. He didn't know what to say. Something had shifted. The power in the room had changed. It was no longer about politics or weapons. It was about memory, about pain, about a voice rising from a quiet corner of Africa and shaking the pillars of the world. A tall U.S. bodyguard stood by the door, strong, still, silent. But something broke in him. His hand trembled. He had been trained not to feel, to protect, not react. But now, he felt something deep inside his chest. He looked at Traoré, then down at his own black skin. This leader, this young man, was saying what his own grandfather once tried to say before he died in Mississippi. "I've stood in many rooms like this," the guard whispered to himself, "but I've never heard words like that." A single tear rolled down his face. No one saw, except Traoré. Their eyes met, just for a second, and the captain gave him a small nod, like he saw through the suit, through the badge, into the soul. The guard stood straighter, not in fear, but in pride. Something had changed in him forever, and outside, viewers from Ghana to Atlanta, Lagos to Detroit, wept with him. Traoré reached into his jacket again, slowly. This time it wasn't a photo. It was a folded piece of paper, old, worn. He looked down at it for a long time before speaking. "This letter," he said softly, "was written by Thomas Sankara the night before he was killed." Gasps echoed. "Not many have seen it," he continued, "but my uncle kept it hidden. He gave it to me the day I became president." He unfolded the paper with care. In it, Sankara had written, "If I must fall, let it be with my head high and my voice never trembling." The room fell silent again. Traoré held it up. "I came here not just as a leader, but as a son of those who never bowed." The old African leaders around him began to cry, not just for what he said, but for what they lost. Hope, courage. And now, somehow, this young man had brought it back. Viewers watching at home began to whisper, "Is he the one? The one who would not bow? The one who would not stand back?" Just as Traoré folded the letter back into his pocket, a chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. An older woman stood up. Her name was Fatou Diallo, 72 years old, head of Guinea's Peace Council. She hadn't spoken in years at international meetings. She often sat quietly, ignored by most. But now her hands trembled with emotion. "Captain," she began, her voice soft but strong. "You remind me of something we buried long ago." She paused. "Not just Sankara, not Lumumba, not Nkrumah." She placed a hand on her chest. "But dignity." Traoré looked at her. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once, deeply. Tears ran down her face as she spoke. "I watched my father die in a protest when I was 10. I've spent 60 years in rooms like this waiting for someone to say what you just said." Then, the impossible happened. She walked around the table and stood behind Traoré. "I will stand here," she said. "If they tell you to step back, they will have to push through me first." The room was stunned. Even the cameras paused. A movement was being born. At the far end of the table sat a man in his 60s. His name was Henri Lavelle, a French diplomat who had spent 30 years in African affairs. He watched Traoré quietly. But inside, something was breaking. He remembered the village he had visited in Ouagadougou in 1998, how the children had no shoes, how the young boys had called him white father and held out empty hands. He remembered what he promised them, and how nothing had changed. Now, watching Traoré speak, something in him began to shake. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered. He turned his face away from the camera, covering his eyes. "Why is he making me feel again?" His aide leaned over. "Sir?" Henri shook his head. "We came to control," he said, voice cracking. "But maybe we were the ones who were lost." Outside the meeting room, his words leaked to the press, and that moment, an old Frenchman admitting regret, was played on TV across Europe. It was no longer just about Traoré's words. It was about truth, finally finding a voice. As the meeting wore on, a quiet buzz came from the media room nearby. A video had just been sent in. One of the organizers ran in holding up a tablet. "Captain, there's something you need to see." He handed it to Traoré. It was a child, barefoot, dust-covered, about 9 years old, standing in the dry heat of rural Burkina Faso. He looked into the camera and said, "Papa Traoré, we saw you on the radio. My mother cried. She said you are not afraid of anyone." He held up a drawing, stick figures of a soldier standing in front of children. Behind him, bombs were falling, but he held up his hand to stop them. "Please don't step back," the boy said. "You are the only one who didn't." The room fell silent once again. Traoré placed the tablet gently on the table. His voice cracked for the first time. "I won't," he whispered. And around the world, millions of people said the same thing under their breath. "Don't step back." As Traoré sat back down, exhausted but calm, the old wooden chair beneath him gave a quiet crack. It was barely noticeable, but he heard it. A small break in the leg, a quiet warning. He touched it gently, then looked at the others. "Even strong chairs break when too much weight is placed on them," he said softly. The metaphor wasn't missed. "I carry more than just my nation," he continued. "I carry the burden of every promise broken, every life ignored." The American diplomat looked uneasy. Traoré leaned forward, voice low. "We were told to sit down, to wait, to be patient. But even chairs can't carry silence forever." The silence that followed was heavy. People in the room didn't just hear him. They felt every word. And at home, watching on screens, older viewers who had once marched in protests, those who had lost sons or mothers or dreams, began to cry. Because they too had been silent chairs. And now, someone was speaking for them. Back at the door, the tall U.S. guard stood motionless. But inside, his world was shifting. His name was Marcus Dean, 58 years old. Retired Marine, served in Iraq, then posted in Africa for diplomatic protection. He had never cried on duty. But now, a memory returned. 25 years ago, he had guarded a peace talk in Liberia. A young woman had run toward the building holding her baby, begging for medicine. No one let her in. That baby died in her arms. Marcus had seen it and walked away. But now, listening to Traoré, he felt that weight return. The baby's face, the mother's scream. And suddenly, without warning, Marcus stepped forward. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He walked to the center of the room and stood beside Traoré. "I was trained to protect power," he said, voice trembling. "But today, I protect truth." The room gasped. The cameras caught everything. And Marcus stood tall for the first time in decades, with tears in his eyes, for the baby, for the silence, for the soul he'd buried long ago. One final chair sat silent. In it was the president of a powerful African country, a man who had ruled for over 25 years. He had built roads, signed treaties, smiled in front of cameras. But now, he was quiet. He stared at Traoré with a mixture of admiration and pain. And slowly, he reached into his own pocket. Out came a letter, yellowed, folded. It was a resignation letter, one he had written years ago, but never sent. "I wrote this the night I ordered troops into my own people's protest," he said softly. "I wanted to step down, but I was afraid." He looked at Traoré. "You are not afraid." Traoré didn't speak, he just listened. The president slowly placed the letter on the table, and for the first time in 20 years he wept in public, the tears of a man who had finally stopped pretending. "I forgot why I started," he whispered. "But your voice, it brought me back." Outside, in cities and villages, elders cried, because they too had forgotten. But now, like this president, they were starting to remember. She had been silent all along. A young woman in her 30s, seated near the far wall with a headset, quietly translating words for the press. Her name was Ruth Ayanbade, from Nigeria. She had translated countless speeches, but this one was different. With every word Traoré spoke, her fingers trembled. Her voice cracked. She didn't know why, until she remembered. Her grandfather had died in 1967, accused of rebellion for hiding villagers during a raid. She had only heard whispers. She never knew the full story. Now she felt him, as if he were sitting right there in the room. She removed her headset. Everyone turned. "I'm just a translator," she said, "but today I must speak." She stood up. "My grandfather couldn't speak. My father stayed silent. But this is the voice they never got to raise." Her tears spilled. "I don't care about my job anymore," she whispered. "I just want my child to live in a world where men like Captain Traoré are heard, not silenced." And for the first time, the entire room, Americans, Africans, old, young, applauded. Not with their hands, with their hearts. Across the room, two men sat on opposite sides. One was Ambassador James Porter, U.S. diplomat with 40 years of service. The other, Kwame Okonkwo, an outspoken Pan-African analyst long critical of the West. They had never spoken outside of official statements. But now, the weight of the moment pressed them together. As the applause died down, Kwame leaned slightly toward James. "What if we were wrong all along?" he asked. James didn't answer immediately. He looked at Traoré, then at the resignation letter still on the table. "My wife died last year," James said quietly. "She was Sierra Leonean. She always said Africa didn't need saving. It needed listening." Kwame's eyes widened. "I never told anyone," James continued, "but she made me promise, and before she passed, that if I ever saw a man like Sankara rise again, I wouldn't stand in his way." A pause. "I think I just met him." And then, two supposed enemies, divided by politics, history, and pride, shook hands under the table. No cameras saw it, but hearts did, including the broken ones watching from hospital beds and nursing homes. They wept, not from sadness, but from the slow, sweet return of hope. Just then, a phone buzzed. It belonged to Traoré. He rarely answered during official meetings, but this time, he looked at the screen. "Papa," he whispered. He stepped aside, turned his back to the cameras. The voice on the line was old, trembling. "Son, I saw it on the radio," his father said. "I saw what you said to them. I had tears in my eyes." Traoré said nothing, just listened. "You were never like other children," his father continued. "When you were small, you cried when the ants were stepped on. You gave your food away to strangers." His voice broke. "I was afraid for you, Ibrahim. This world doesn't reward gentle souls, but now I see. It needs them." A long pause. Then came the words that shattered even Traoré's strong silence. "You made me proud today. Not because you stood strong, but because you stayed kind." Traoré turned back to the room, eyes misty. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. And across the world, fathers who had never said those words before whispered them now. Even if no one heard. Even if it was too late. A woman stood up from the far back corner. She had been silent the whole time. She looked over 70. Thin glasses, wrinkled hands, a worn-out scarf. Her name was Amelia Carter, a retired diplomat from the U.S. State Department. She held a folded paper close to her chest. "I came here today not as a guest," she said, voice trembling. "I came as a ghost." Everyone turned. "I wrote this letter in 1987 to stop the assassination of Thomas Sankara." Gasps. "But I never sent it. I was young, scared. I was told to stay quiet, that it was bigger than me." She stepped forward. I watched history break, and I never forgave myself. Tears ran down her cheeks as she handed the letter to Captain Traoré. Ibrahim, you are the second chance I prayed for every night since then. Traoré held the paper with both hands, and for the first time in his life, he cried in front of the world, not from pain, but from a prayer, finally answered, a prayer shared by millions who had carried guilt in silence for decades. And now, they wept too. Suddenly, the lights flickered. More officials entered. More media. The moment was now fully global. The American diplomat from earlier, his face now tense, spoke again. This is over, Captain. Stand back. And that was it. The moment everyone would replay for years to come. Traoré looked straight into his eyes, calm, steady, and said just 3 words. Africa stands forward. Not shouted, just spoken. But it shook the room. The diplomat sat back down. Everyone else stood. The cameras zoomed in. News outlets flashed headlines. Social media exploded. Africa stands forward trended in 76 countries within hours. In homes, in villages, in crowded cities, people stood from their chairs. They raised their heads. They wept. And for many older viewers, it was the moment they had waited for their whole lives. A moment when fear finally bowed to courage. And history began to heal. As Traoré prepared to leave the room, he paused at the door. There stood Marcus, the U.S. Marine who had earlier stepped forward. Marcus saluted, but not with stiffness, not with duty. He saluted as a man who had once been broken, but now felt whole. Sir, he said gently, if you ever need someone to guard your hope, I'm ready. Traoré smiled, not as a soldier, not as a leader, but as a son, a brother, a witness to grace. He didn't reply with words. He simply placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. And together, they walked out, not as enemies, but as men finally free from silence. Dear viewer, if this story touched you, if it made you cry, remember or believe again, don't let it end here. Please like this video, not for the channel but for every voice that was once silenced. Subscribe, so we can keep sharing stories that speak to the soul. And comment below. Tell us who you stood for today. Tell us who you remember. Because stories like this one only matter when you become part of them. Let's keep standing forward, together.